So I want to talk about success, and I want to talk about some successful companies, some of which you might have heard of. Um, who here, by the way, has heard of Woolworths? Cool. So just a few trivia about Woolworths. It was founded in 1878. It had 596 stores by 1912. In 1910, by the way, they bought a new skyscraper for cash. And that skyscraper was built from 1910 to 1913, and from 1913 to 1930, it was the tallest building in the world. You'll really value this bit of trivia at some point, I'm sure. In 1979, the Guinness Book of World Records said the Woolworths was the biggest department store in the world, and it closed all of its stores in 1997. There's an asterisk there because due to the way sort of financial transactions go, they ended up actually selling a little bit of themselves to this company that became the Venator Group, which then became the Foot Locker. So Foot Locker is like the very tiny sort of successor to Woolworths. Another example, Radio Shack was founded in 1921. Tandy bought them. Tandy, by the way, was a leather goods company that wanted to diversify. So they bought Radio Shack in the 1960s. Eventually, they renamed themselves Radio Shack. And by 1990, we're the world's biggest producer of personal computers. At some point in the 90s, there were about 7,300 Radio Shack stores, which meant that 95% of US households were within 3 miles of a Radio Shack, which is still, by the way, only about half the density of Starbucks. And they went bankrupt in 2015. And they went bankrupt in 2017 again. That takes talent, by the way. Lastly, I want to talk about Yahoo, founded in 1994. They were worth about $108 billion in 2000, sometime in January of 2000. In 2008, after they lost about half of their value, Microsoft offered $45 billion to the Yahoo board, which I'm guessing did some sort of version of, we're good. And then this year, actually, they got purchased by Verizon for about 1/10 of that, or 1/20 of their all-time high. So what happens there? You know, you get these companies, they get big, they get really successful. Each one of these companies was the #1 in the world for something at some point, and then they died. So I was thinking about this, and I was reading the work of Simon Wardley, this big sort of technologist from the UK, who described this sort of maturity cycle for products, where you go from Genesis, which is, hey, I have an idea, like let's do some sort of, disruptive Twitter for pets or something. And then you have some sort of custom-built product. When you want to turn it into a real product, that's when you want to make sort of, multiple people be able to use it. And then at the end stage of maturity, you get commodity and utility. This is the really interesting and exciting phase, and this is ideally not very interesting and exciting. So for example, electricity these days is in the utility stage, and I don't know about you, but the one thing I really don't want from electricity is interesting and exciting. So Wardley mapped 3 kinds of people to this cycle. He talked about pioneers who are pretty good at dealing with the Genesis and the custom-built phase. Settlers, which are great for turning sort of custom products into some sort of mainstream product, and what he called town planners. We'll look at sort of what they do in a second. And so you've got these 3 kinds of people, and he described pioneers as people who explore never-before-discovered concepts, the uncharted land. Settlers turn half-baked things into something useful for a larger audience, and town planners turn something and industrialize it, taking advantage of economies of scale. So show of hands, who thinks that pioneers are the best thing? Nobody? Really? Yeah. I mean, look, I like pioneers. We wouldn't have a bunch of innovation if it wasn't for pioneers. Good. Anybody think that settlers are actually the best thing? Yeah, okay, good. A few hands. Anybody for town planners? Yeah. Again, we wouldn't have boring electricity, the best kind, if we didn't have town planners. So the truth is that you probably need some version of some of these in your company, and if your company is young, then you're naturally going to have a whole bunch of pioneers, right? Like, if you have, you've just founded a company and you've hired your first engineer, almost by definition, chances are that engineer, if she's going to be successful, is more of the pioneer than the town planner. As a company gets older, you need more settlers and eventually more town planners. But at some point, your company sort of solidifies, and it becomes a little hard to change. To illustrate that, I want to talk about this. Does anybody recognize this ship, by the way? I figured the odds were low, but I'd ask. This is the battleship. Close call. In fact, I'm going to talk about the Bismarck. This is actually the Yamato, which is even more of a badass battleship than the Bismarck, I would argue. The Yamato was launched by the Japanese Navy in World War II. It was, they started working on it in 1937. They launched it December 16th, 1941, about 9 days after a day that we live in infamy. I would argue that this was the most impressive battleship to ever sail the seas. It displaced about 70,000 tons, which is about 70% of the U.S.'s biggest modern aircraft carriers. It had about 26 inches of armor in some parts, 16 inches of armor at the waterline, which is insane. It had 18.1 inch, or for the metrics fans among us, 45 centimeter guns, the biggest that were ever put on battleships. And when I looked at the Yamato, I found something kind of interesting. The Yamato was launched in 1941 after about 4 years of construction. And the 1941 armament actually was quite different from the 1944 armament after it went through a refit. This was the 1941 armament. This was the 1944 armament. Anybody see any sort of meaningful difference? Yeah, so somebody mentioned, we went from 24 1-inch guns to 162 1-inch guns, which is practically 138 more of them. Anybody want to guess why? Sorry? Aha. Yes, aircraft. So let's talk about disruptive innovation. In 1913, we had the first aerial attack on a ship. Not exactly correct. This was actually a boat. This was in Mexico during their war, and a pilot simply built some pipe bombs and threw them from his plane onto some federal gunboats. In 1915, we had the first sort of organized aircraft torpedo attack and the first sinking of a boat during World War I. In 1921, during an exercise, a squadron illustrated that they could actually sink a German battleship under the best of conditions. This was the SMS Ostfriesland. So remember, the Yamato gets built starting in 1937. By the time it's finished in 1941, a few interesting things have happened that might make you nervous if you're a battleship captain. For one thing, in 1940, the battleship Bismarck is the first battleship to be sunk with air assist during a war. So that's, potentially ominous. And then also in 1940, you have the first major ship, the Königsberg, sunk solely by aircraft. So what you've got is the Japanese built the best battleship in the world, and by the time that they actually built this ship, it was no longer particularly well placed to deal with the premier threats to ships in World War II. Anybody, by the way, want to take a guess? And this is easy. It's a gimme. It's not a trick. How the Yamato was sunk? So that's the problem, right? Big is in many respects is pretty good. When I look at, for example, my company, Netflix, we're a mid-size online video subscription company. There are some things that we have a whole bunch of. We have a pretty reasonable amount of money to play with. We have a bunch of really smart engineers, literally hundreds of them. We have relationships with our vendors and partners that are pretty tight, where they are deeply interested in our success. We have enough bandwidth to satisfy about 37% of the internet's desire for Orange is the New Black. We have a whole bunch of knowledge about how to run things in the cloud. We have access to what I like to call low-interest technical debt. Because we have this many engineers, we can actually do new things and launch them as MVPs in potentially sort of terrible operational state, knowing with a certain degree of confidence that we'll actually be able to go back and fix them if this ends up working out as we expect to. We also have relatively little existential fear. There's a whole bunch of ways we could lose customers and we could damage our business, but the odds of us not being able to make payroll next week are hopefully pretty low. And so that allows us to be a little more experimental. And lastly, there's a whole bunch of problems that I would say that we've solved at least relatively adequately. So that's all good news, except that also, of course, big is bad. It's hard to maintain pioneers if you're big and you're potentially moving slowly as a company. It can become kind of easy to be complacent. A lack of existential fear can result in some overconfidence. You can be a bigger target. Everybody's interested in you, and of course, just like the Amanda demonstrated, the bigger targets are easier to hit. It takes you a while to make changes. Turning radius on container ships is measured in something like on the order of about a mile. And you can potentially fall prey to, we've solved this, like this problem, we could do better, but you know what, it works reasonably well for us. So how do we deal with this? What are some mechanisms to help? Well, I want to start with heresy. Heresy is the belief or opinion contrary to orthodox religious doctrine, or opinion profoundly at odds with what is generally accepted. I would say the first one applies in tech companies just as well as in religions. And I think the ability to actually encourage people to speak against the status quo and come up with radical and profoundly at odds ideas about how we do things can be significantly helpful to your success. For an example of that, I want to talk about a few cases where I've seen that here. In 2008, some engineers at Netflix decided that maybe we should actually go to 100% to the cloud. So does anybody here remember 2008? Does anybody here remember whether or not it looked sort of reasonable and sane for large, profitable, public enterprise companies to be 100% in the cloud? Because I got to tell you, I was in IT at Netflix at the time, running data centers and production hardware, and I thought that was stupid. And I was not the only one. Another example is originals. Netflix used to be essentially a completely licensed content company. We licensed all our content from various content providers. Now we actually produce a bunch of originals, and we have actually said that we want to get to the point where about 50% of our catalog is original content. Open Connect is our open CDN. And it's worth noting that while we moved to Amazon to do all the heavy lifting, we had a bunch of relationships with really solid third-party CDNs, and we had somebody in the company who argued that we should actually have our own CDN, which on the face of it looks kind of controversial, and in fact, he was dealing with a whole bunch of flack. I remember him talking to me about various meetings he had with Reed, our CEO, and arguing with him until finally Reed gave up, and that proved out to be reasonably good. Containers are actually a really good example of this that's somewhat personal. About 3 years ago, we had an engineer join our traffic and chaos team, actually, and and that team has nothing to do with containers. And about 6 months in, he started arguing that Netflix should do containers. And there were a whole bunch of people at Netflix who said, well, that seems kind of silly. I mean, we've already solved the whole deployment problem reasonably well, and containers are just like, the cool thing that all the, cool kids do. I want to be honest here. I was one of those people. I went to some large meetings and argued vocally that, this was just a stupid effort. He persisted. And he brought up a small proof of concept. He got some people at Netflix interested in using it, and now we actually have a whole team responsible for moving containers forward for Netflix. And lastly, and I'll talk a little more about this in a few moments, there's a deployment and orchestration story that I want to tell in a bit. So what does it take to be a good heretic? Well, I actually want to talk first about what it looks like to be a terrible heretic. Once, a long time ago, I interviewed somebody for Netflix, and I came out of the interview being absolutely certain that we should hire him. He was incredibly smart. He was persuasive. He was everything we were looking for. So I went to the hiring manager and I said, yes, 1,000 times yes. You would be a fool not to hire him. And we hired him. He was supposed to be our IT person working with engineering to move to the cloud. So we were going to move to the cloud together. And so he sat down with engineering, and they told him, we're thinking of doing it this way in the cloud. And he would listen to them, and then he would say, well, some version of that idea is stupid, and you're stupid, and you should feel bad. Though I think, from what I remember, there were a lot more profanities involved. So he did that, and he did that for a surprisingly short amount of time before the natural outcome from being a heretic caught up with him, and he left Netflix. So what does it look like to actually be a great heretic? For this, I want to talk first about the Overton window. Is everybody here familiar with the Overton window? So the Overton window was coined by a guy named Joseph Overton, which is basically the idea that an idea's political viability depends mainly on whether it falls within this window rather than on politicians' individual preferences. So this basically represents what's considered normal or acceptable as ideas for a given population at a given point of time. So at the middle of this window, we have policy. And then sort of a little further from the middle, you have ideas that are popular, then sensible, acceptable, radical, and unthinkable. As an example of this, for example, 200 years ago, I would argue that women being able to vote would have been unthinkable. 100 years ago, we were still fighting about this. Women formally got the right to vote in 1920. So 100 years ago, women in the US still couldn't vote. And these days, so that, 100 years ago, you would say maybe that was radical. And these days, I would hope everybody agrees, the idea that women should be able to vote is a matter of policy and, relatively unarguable. In fact, some people would even tell you that a woman won the popular vote in the last presidential election. So if the heretic's position sort of maps to that policy, you could actually argue that that's not heresy. We talked about heresy being some sort of profound disagreement. This is as non-disagreement as it gets. We should do everything we're doing. Yay. So if you think about the heretic's position as essentially having some sort of distance from the middle point of the window, think of this as potential. This is almost like potential energy and potential work. It maps to the potential benefit of this difference of opinion, and it also maps to the likely amount of cost that it'll take the heretic to essentially persuade others that they're right. In order to do that, in my experience, having worked with some really effective heretics, it takes sort of three major qualities. One is clarity. You've got to actually be able to describe why it is that your position is valuable and correct and beneficial to the company. As I mentioned, the person who was pushing containers did that not necessarily well enough for everybody to be persuaded, but well enough that a few people were persuaded, and that started the ball rolling. The person who joined us for a short amount of time and was explaining to people why they were wrong was less effective at describing the benefit of their position. The other one is capital. The more people trust you, the more people value you, the more people sort of assume that you're right coming into conversations, the easier this will be. And the last one is actually an interesting collaboration. This is pretty important. I've known a whole bunch of engineers who believe that being right is enough. Who here has a friend or has ever seen somebody who sort of thought that being right was sufficient? I'm that person, by the way. I fight that tendency. And the thing is, it's not true. Listen, if you're wrong, I don't care if you're effective. But if you're right, you have a duty to actually being effective at convincing people and actually working with people to actually agree with you. Otherwise, you're basically squandering this advantage you have in service of your company. So that's heresy. So, the Yamato. Battleships went out of vogue in World War II for some obvious reasons, and we replaced them with aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers are the sort of current major way to project force on the seas. This is the most recent supercarrier that was commissioned by the Navy. This is the George W. Bush. It was commissioned in 2009. It cost about $6 billion. It's got about 5,500 service people. 2009, by the way, is relevant, and I'll get to that in a second. Carriers are expensive and a little bit vulnerable, and so generally speaking, much like some of us living in sketchy areas, they don't leave home alone. So when carriers steam out of port, they leave as part of a carrier strike group, which has a bunch of cruisers, a bunch of destroyers, maybe some submarines, so they can basically sort of protect themselves. Which is great, which is why it's actually very hard to take down a carrier, except for this thing. This is the Chinese DF-21D, known to be the first anti-surface ballistic missile. It has a range of about 1,000 miles. It flies at supersonic speed, and it has a 300 kiloton nuclear warhead. In 2009, the same year that the Bush was commissioned, and by the way, the same year that the next family of carriers was started with the laying down of the keel of the Ford. That's, by the way, after Gerald Ford, not the car company, thankfully. The U.S. Naval Institute did a bit of research and said that at the time, there were no known countermeasures to the DF-21D. So this could wipe out a carrier and actually most of the strike group in one fell swoop. And the thing is, you know, we can probably do some things about it, but it's kind of hard to know whether or not we got this right. And the cost of a failure would be terrible, right? Like if you lose a carrier, that's about $6 billion for the previous generation carriers, about $12 billion for the current generation carriers, thousands of deaths, a huge morale loss. And so there's some conjecture and some concern that because of the existence of this missile and the desire to not lose carriers, in a situation where we have conflict with China, we are likely to keep carriers away in port, safe, which means that we no longer can use them effectively because we are afraid of failure. So let's talk about failure for a second. I'm looking forward to somebody tweeting that I got this wrong. So when I moved over from IT to engineering at Netflix, for about 18 months, I was an individual contributor reporting to my manager, and every quarter, I'd sit down with my manager and say, here are like 2 or 3 interesting things I'd like to work on that we haven't yet solved very well. And I actually did a bit of a report card that looked at my record over those 18 months. So I picked up about 12 different projects. It doesn't really matter what each of them was. And you can see that about 50% of them failed, which actually kind of sounds terrible. It makes you wonder why Netflix kept me, which, well, it makes me wonder. Except that most of those failures were actually relatively inexpensive. So a bunch of these failures where I'm going to try something, and I worked for about 4 to 6 weeks to come up with some sort of, proof of concept. And at the end of that, we decided that it wasn't worth the effort. The successful stuff ended up lasting much, much longer. Typically got taken up by teams that were much better at writing production code, the people who are settlers and town planners, and has continued to this day. Because as an engineer, by the way, I am what you might call charitably somebody who writes pioneer-level code and proof of concept code. In fact, some of my coworkers have looked at my code and said that it was a complete POS. And I didn't have the heart to tell them that it's actually spelled POC. So lastly, I want to talk a little about dissent and the idea of the override bar, which is who actually wins in a disagreement between somebody and their boss. A while ago, I had an engineer come to me with a really interesting proposal. He wanted to basically build a deployment and orchestration system for my team. At the time, Netflix had Asgard, which was used by virtually everybody else. And he said, well, Asgard doesn't really work very well for us for these reasons. And so I want to build this thing that's going to duplicate Asgard, but be much, much better for us. It would be a complete customized fit. And I remember clearly at the time thinking, this is a stupid idea. But I have this override bar. And the override bar is essentially a formal definition of when I'm going to override an engineer. And it requires, for me, 2 questions to be answered affirmatively. 1, am I sure this is the wrong thing? Not like, do I think so? Not like, yeah, this doesn't seem right, but like, am I absolutely certain? And the other one is, if I'm right, will this be really expensive? In this case, it actually failed both of those questions. I wasn't sure it was the wrong thing, and if it was the wrong thing, then I would have had 1 engineer out of 10 working for a quarter on this. So think about that as 10% of my bandwidth being thrown away on experiment. For me, at the time, that was a reasonable bet. So this actually ended up accomplishing our predicted results. It massively simplified operational processes. My team is responsible for about 14,000 servers. In about 1,000 different clusters of servers. And all of that operational overhead is essentially automated. We don't have any ops people, of course. We're 20 people who mostly write software and product rather than operate 14,000 servers. It improved our resiliency and velocity. And it also had some interesting results we didn't expect, like some teams actually wanted to use this. And it ended up being an inspiration for some of the decisions in Spinnaker, which is Netflix's next generation deployment and orchestration system, which is much closer to what we needed. And one of these days, we expect to retire this and move on to Spinnaker. So another way to look at this is the idea of the DRI, or directly responsible individual. So if you think about a sphere of autonomy as the concept of defining in what area you actually have the right to make decisions. There's an engineer in my group called Siley, and there's an area where she makes decisions, obviously. And in the classic environment, Siley, reporting to a manager under me called Vinay, basically has her sphere of autonomy overlapped with Vinay's sphere of autonomy, right? Because Vinay's sphere of autonomy would obviously include the sphere of autonomy for every one of his engineers, because he can override them. And then, of course, Vinay's sphere of autonomy is not as big as mine, because my sphere of autonomy envelops Vinay's, and this goes on and on and on. The other approach to do this is one where I would argue that these spheres of autonomy don't actually have any overlap. This means that whatever decision Siley gets to make, Vinay doesn't. And whatever decision Vinay gets to make, I don't get to make. I can give him feedback, we can discuss it, we can even potentially argue about it, but if it's in Vinay's sphere of autonomy, I don't get to tell him to do something different. This has worked really effectively for me and my team. So that's it. That's all great news. And there's really no downside, except that one, you can see a bunch of duplication of effort, because teams will do stuff that essentially duplicates what another team might be doing. Experimentation will inevitably lead to dead ends. You'll end up with potential friction, either because you're duplicating some other team's work and they get annoyed, or because you're actually talking to them about how to do that, which takes effort. It's not necessarily short-term the most efficient use of headcount, and it can result in potentially slower execution. So, one slide version, really. Be clear and egoless about the override bar. I'm not saying use this override bar, but I am saying pick an override bar that works for you, be clear about that, actually be accountable for that. So publish to the people who should care about this what your override bar is, and encourage dissent, encourage freedom, encourage failure, and heresy. It'll cost you, but dying's more expensive if you ask Woolworths and Radio Shack. So lastly, I want to talk about something else. Who here is not the CEO and owner of their own small company? There's a potential to sit here and to listen to me and say, well, I just work in the company I work at, and I can't really make this happen for the whole company. Who here has had that thought at least once during this conversation, by the way? Be proud. You're right. You can't. But I'll tell you this. There's no company where I've worked where I've had more ability to do this than Netflix. But I've worked in a bunch of other companies that were quite different. In every company I've worked at, I've had a certain sphere of influence. That is a sphere where generally people, for some reason, listen to me. That is a sphere where I can actually try something, irrespective of the prevailing company culture. Everything I've just talked about here, I would argue, does not necessarily require the whole company to follow this. You can, within your sphere of autonomy and within your sphere of influence, start experimenting with this. This is not for, the CEO who can come back and say, hey, we're all going to do this. This is for every single one of you. So, with that, I wanted to make sure I left enough time for questions, which looks like about 3 minutes. There's a URL here where you can actually send me anonymous feedback, or if you want to identify yourself, if you want a response, I'd love to hear from you. And lastly, tomorrow between 11:25 a.m. and 12:05 p.m., I'll be at the O'Reilly booth answering more questions. But what can I tell you right now that you don't already know? Yeah.
Let's say somebody is a heretic and they go on this exploratory journey, and it comes back as a minor failure. And a few months later, somebody else wants to go on the same journey, with maybe a slightly different twist, but relatively the same journey. Do you, at that point, override and say, hey, this is not a good idea, I've tried this before, or do you still let them experiment?
So the question was, let's say somebody tried something, failed, and then a few months later somebody else wants to try something that's substantially similar? Do you override them with, like, we've tried this before, or do you give them the chance to try it? Well, it's not the same situation, right? So things have changed on the ground. Unless you're absolutely certain that, by the way, let me rephrase this. I'm telling you how I think about this. You figure out your own approach. I would be very loath to override, right? Because things change. By definition, it's a different situation because it's a different person. I would definitely encourage them to talk to the first person who experimented and then learn from that, and maybe they'll come back from that. I've had people do that, by the way, and come back and go, you know what? Things aren't actually different enough. I'm not going to do this. And if they still want to experiment, go for it, as long as you can afford the experimental, cost. Does that make sense? Am I out of time?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, good. So, sorry, question?
How much of your team do you think about how much of your time you want spent on the pioneering projects versus other types of, town planning or settling or whatever the other types of
So the question was, do you think about how much time you want to spend on pioneering activity versus settling or town planning activity? I think about that, though I mostly think about what my customers need and figure out sort of what's appropriate for them. So the question is, where are we best spending our time to serve our customers? I know myself. So one of the things I didn't talk about here is I think it's actually valuable. If you think about the pioneer, settler, town planner sort of personas, I think it's useful for everybody to sort of know where they stand. So for example, I know I'm a pioneer engineer and I'm a settler manager. I have been terrible as a manager in a town planning kind of situation, and I've not been all that great as a manager in a pioneer situation. So with these tendencies, I know, for example, that my team tends to be a little more town planning and settlery. I apologize for adjectivizing nouns. And I try to sort of pay attention to where we probably need to spend maybe a little more time pioneering and pushing people, but I also look at the mix of people I've got and try to have a relatively diverse team from those personas' perspective, and then I sort of trust people to do the right thing. Did I answer your question? Good. Any other questions? Yeah, sorry. So the question was, if you know that something might be a good thing to do, but that person is likely to fail in doing it, would I override it? Nah, I think I'd go the other way around. If it's a good thing to do, and given their skills, they are likely to fail doing it, then obviously I need to help them. I'll give you an example. There was an engineer who worked for me at some point, and I needed a new product built, and I said, hey, do you want to be a product manager for this product? And she said, oh, I've never done that before. I don't know how I would do this. And I was like, awesome, that's not the answer to my question. I'm a jerk. And she thought about it, and she said, yes, I'd like to, but again, I have no idea. And I was like, okay, good, we'll work together. I promise you, if you fail, you'll fail soft. She did not fail. She was actually fantastic at it. So no, I mean, again, if it's the right thing to do, then just from a perspective of investing in people and assuming that person is at least willing to say, I don't actually know how to do this, that seems like a wonderful opportunity to sort of get a bunch of things done at the same time. Does that make sense? Good. Any other? Yeah. So the question is, let's say you have a team that wants to do a bunch of experimentation, more than essentially your experimentation budget. How do you pick? Is that a reasonable? So what I've generally done in that case is actually sit down with the team and say, here are the ideas on the table. And the thing is, it's the experimentation budget is not valid by itself. It's, if you have like 10 or 15%, it's because you've got like 80 or 85% of like other stuff product work, efficiency work. And so, I say, look, this is the stuff that we also need to be doing. How do we balance this? I have a bunch of really senior, really smart people. Generally speaking, my job as a manager in my company is defined as setting context. That's about it. So I have a general belief that if I set the context and we have this conversation, and then I go, okay, so what do we pick? People will do the right thing. So far, that's not that assumption has not failed, but I've been lucky, and I have a fantastic team. I have a fantastic team. There you go. Yeah.
So when you evaluate something with your override bar and you determine that you think it's a bad idea, but the cost is low, do you communicate the fact that you think it's a bad idea with the person who's working on the project or not?
Good question. No. In fact, actually, I was thinking, like, what would I do? And then I realized, so this thing, right? Like, let's build our own deployment system. I remember again thinking, if you think that the idea is bad, but it's an acceptable cost, do you communicate that you think the idea is bad to the person? So this person, he might be watching this. I remember explicitly thinking, this is stupid. I never actually said, this is stupid. As a manager, I have tremendous power. And that means that even expressing an opinion is a form of power, right? And I want to use that thoughtfully and carefully. So if I'm willing to move it forward, then great, and I can talk about it. But expressing that opinion feels like it's like basically overriding without taking the responsibility for overriding. If that makes any sense. Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Do I have like another 90 seconds, like 2 minutes? Okay, good. So this concludes this presentation. I have a funny story about taking down carriers and carrier strike groups for people who are interested in naval combat trivia. In 2002, the Navy did a massive war exercise called Millennium Challenge 2002. Look it up on Wiki. It took them about 2 years to prep it. It cost about $250 million. And what they did was they created this fictional situation where there was a dictator of a foreign country, and they went to war with that dictator. They picked for the dictator this retired Army general named Paul Van Riper. And this is one of the exercises where they didn't actually set parameters at the beginning. So basically both sides, the US force and the opposing force, OPFOR, were allowed to do whatever the hell they wanted to in this combat. So 2-week exercise. On the first day, the US gives the opposing dictator an ultimatum: step down or we will attack your country. Paul Van Riper, who had gotten most of his experience in Vietnam and after Vietnam, did a few things that the US side did not expect. For one thing, he did not communicate with his forces via radio because they knew that they'd be overheard. So he used calls to prayer as a way to communicate information and motorcycle messengers. The other thing he did was he flooded the Gulf, this was in the Persian Gulf, with a bunch of leisure craft. Fishermen boats, fishing boats, yachts, a bunch of like that stuff. So, first day, ultimatum. Second day, he launches a surprise attack using a ton of small boats, most of which, by the way, failed, because, who can stand up to the Navy? But enough of them came through to the point where basically he sank a carrier, I think something like 3 cruisers and about 9 amphibious ships, for a total loss of about 22,000 sailors in this hypothetical exercise. It was an interesting reminder of the potential non-invincibility of our current carrier groups. And I found it fascinating. I hope I didn't just waste your time. By the way, one quick fact. After that, what the US side did was they basically refloated their entire Navy, and they reset the rules so he couldn't actually make unpredictable decisions, at which point basically the whole exercise was completely fixed, and Paul Van Riper resigned in protest. There you go. You know something you didn't know before.